On the morning of November 17, 1922, a 61-year-old man named Maimed VI climbed into the back of a British military ambulance parked outside the Yildiz Palace in Istanbul. He was wearing a simple overcoat. He carried two small suitcases. With him went his son, his physician, his chamberlain, and a handful of servants. The ambulance rolled quietly through the rain-soaked streets of the city. His ancestors had ruled for 469 years and delivered him to the docks, where a British warship called HMS Malaya was waiting to carry him into exile. Maimed VI was the 36th Sultan of the Ottoman dynasty. He was also the last. By the time the Malaya cleared the harbor and steamed out into the Sea of Marmara, an empire that had lasted 623 years, that had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Yemen, that had controlled 3 continents and ruled over tens of millions of subjects, was simply gone. Not defeated in a final battle, not torn apart by a single catastrophic event, just gone. Erased in the space of a few short years by a collapse so total and so sudden that historians still argue about exactly when it ended and exactly what killed it. If you had asked anyone in Istanbul in the summer of 1914 about the future of the Ottoman Empire, they would have told you it had problems, but it was still very much alive. They had good reason to think so. The empire still ruled over modern-day Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq, parts of Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. It commanded the loyalty of the Sunni Muslim world through the office of the caliphate. It had a standing army of hundreds of thousands of men. It had reformed its institutions, modernized its military, built railways, opened schools, and was actively rebuilding itself into something that could survive in the 20th century. 8 years later, every single one of those things was gone. The army had been destroyed. The territories had been carved up by foreign powers. The caliphate would be abolished within 16 months of Maimed's exile. The dynasty that had conquered Constantinople under Maimed II, that had besieged Vienna under Suleiman the Magnificent, that had outlived the Byzantines, the Mamluks, and the Holy Roman Empire, would vanish from the political map of the earth. How does that happen? To understand how the Ottoman Empire collapsed overnight, you have to understand that it had been dying slowly for over 100 years before it actually died. By the early 1800s, European powers had already started calling it the sick man of Europe, a phrase reportedly coined by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia in conversation with a British diplomat. The sickness was real. The empire had lost wars to Russia, lost territory in the Balkans, lost Egypt to a rebellious governor, and lost the technological edge that had once made its armies the terror of Christendom. But the sick man refused to die. Through the 19th century, Ottoman reformers launched a series of programs called the Tanzimat, which translated roughly to reorganization. They modernized the legal code. They built a new conscript army on European lines. They opened military schools, medical schools, engineering schools. They invited French and German officers to train their troops. They built telegraph lines and railways. They drafted a constitution in 1876, becoming one of the first non-European powers to attempt parliamentary government. The problem was that every reform created new tensions. The army officers who had been educated in European-style military academies came back home, looked at the corruption and inefficiency of the imperial court, and began to question whether the Sultan should be running anything at all. The non-Muslim subjects, granted new legal equality under the reforms, began demanding more autonomy. Nationalist movements exploded across the Balkans. Greece had already broken away in the 1820s. Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Montenegro followed. By 1908, when a group of reformist officers calling themselves the Young Turks staged a revolution and forced Sultan Abdul Hamid II to restore the constitution, the empire had already lost most of its European territory. The Young Turks were modernizers, nationalists, and pragmatists. They believed they could save the empire by transforming it into a constitutional state held together by a new shared Ottoman identity. Within a few years, 3 of them, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Semel Pasha, had concentrated most of the real political power in their own hands. They became known as the 3 Pashas. They were ambitious. They were ruthless, and they were about to make a decision that would destroy everything their predecessors had spent a century trying to save. They were going to take the empire into a world war. In the summer of 1914, when Europe began sliding toward war, the Ottoman Empire had a choice to make. It could stay neutral, watch the great powers tear each other apart, and use the breathing room to continue its slow recovery, or it could pick a side. Enver Pasha, the youngest and most aggressive of the three pashas, had already made up his mind. He wanted an alliance with Germany. The reasoning was not insane. Germany was the rising industrial power of Europe. Germany had been training Ottoman officers for 2 decades. Germany was the one major power that had no territorial ambitions in Ottoman lands, unlike Britain, which wanted Egypt and the oil of Mesopotamia, unlike France, which wanted Syria, unlike Russia, which had spent 2 centuries trying to push south toward Constantinople and the warm water ports of the Mediterranean. A German alliance, in Enver's mind, was the only way to deter the Russians from finally finishing the empire off. On August 2, 1914, just as the war was beginning, the Ottomans signed a secret defensive alliance with Germany. They were not committed to fighting yet. They were just hedging. But within days, 2 German warships, the Goeben and the Breslau, were chased through the Mediterranean by the British fleet and ducked into Ottoman waters to escape. Rather than intern the ships, the Ottoman government did something extraordinary. It bought them. On paper, the Goeben and Breslau became Ottoman vessels overnight, complete with new names and Turkish flags. Their German crews stayed aboard. Their German admiral was given an Ottoman rank. In October of 1914, those same ships, still crewed by Germans, still commanded by a German admiral, sailed into the Black Sea and bombarded Russian ports without any formal declaration of war. It is still debated whether Enver Pasha personally authorized the attack or whether the Germans went rogue and dragged the empire in. Either way, the result was the same. Russia declared war on the Ottomans. Britain and France followed within days. The empire was committed. Enver Pasha believed he was about to lead the Ottomans to a glorious victory. He believed German technology and Ottoman manpower would crush the Russians in the Caucasus, drive the British out of Egypt, and reclaim the Muslim provinces lost over the previous century. He had grand visions of a pan-Turkic empire stretching from Istanbul to Central Asia. Within 3 months, those visions would die in a frozen mountain pass. In December of 1914, Enver Pasha personally took command of the Third Army on the Caucasus front. He had a plan. He would march roughly 100,000 men through the mountains in the dead of winter, swing around the Russian flank, and destroy them in a battle of encirclement near a place called Sarikamish. It was the kind of operation that looked brilliant on a map. It was the kind of operation that gets soldiers killed. The temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero. The men had not been issued proper winter gear. The supply lines collapsed almost immediately because nobody could move wagons through chest-deep snow in mountain passes that even the locals avoided in January. Soldiers froze to death in their sleep, sometimes still standing upright. Frostbite took fingers, toes, and feet by the thousands. Men who could not keep up were simply left behind to die in the snow. When the broken remnants of Enver's army finally reached Sarikamish on December 29th, the Russians were waiting and well dug in. The battle that followed was less a battle than a slaughter. Out of the 100,000 men Enver had led into the mountains, roughly 75,000 were lost. Most of them never fired a shot. They froze. Enver returned to Istanbul, blamed the disaster on Armenian collaborators with the Russians, and used that accusation to help justify what came next. In April of 1915, the Ottoman government began the systematic deportation and mass killing of its Armenian population. By the end of the war, somewhere between 600,000 and 1.5 million Armenian civilians had been murdered or starved to death. The Armenian genocide is, on its own, one of the defining atrocities of the 20th century. For our story, it also matters because it shattered any remaining illusion that the multi-ethnic, multi-religious Ottoman Empire could hold together as anything other than a Turkish nation-state. That same April, the British and French launched the Gallipoli campaign, attempting to force the Dardanelles, capture Istanbul, and knock the Ottomans out of the war in a single stroke. They failed catastrophically, in large part because of an obscure Ottoman colonel named Mustafa Kemal, who held the line at a place called Chunuk Bair and refused to let it break. Remember that name. He is going to matter more than anyone else in this story. But the empire's troubles were only beginning. In June of 1916, the empire's southern flank tore open. Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the Hashemite emir of Mecca and guardian of the holy cities, raised the flag of revolt against the Sultan Caliph he had sworn to serve. The Arab Revolt had begun. Hussein had been negotiating in secret with the British for over a year. In exchange for rising against the Ottomans, he believed he had been promised an independent Arab kingdom stretching from Syria to the Arabian Peninsula. The British had no intention of actually delivering that kingdom. But Hussein did not know that yet. A young British intelligence officer named T.E. Lawrence was attached to Hussein's son Faisal as a liaison. Lawrence is remembered today as Lawrence of Arabia, but at the time he was a 28-year-old archaeologist with a gift for languages and a romantic streak that made him unusually effective at convincing Bedouin tribesmen to attack Ottoman railways. The Hijaz Railway, the spine of Ottoman control in Arabia, became a target practice range. Trains were derailed, stations were burned, garrisons were besieged. Ottoman troops sent to suppress the revolt got bogged down in a guerrilla war they could not win in terrain they did not understand. While the Arabs hammered the empire from the south, the British were grinding forward from two other directions. In Mesopotamia, after suffering a humiliating defeat at Kut in 1916, where an entire British division surrendered to Ottoman forces, the British rebuilt their army and came back harder. Baghdad fell in March of 1917. In Palestine, General Edmund Allenby methodically advanced through Gaza and Beersheba and entered Jerusalem on foot in December of 1917, the first Christian conqueror to take the city in nearly 7 centuries. The empire was hemorrhaging territory faster than it could be defended. The Ottoman army, exhausted and starving, was disintegrating by desertion. Soldiers walked away from their units by the tens of thousands and just went home. By 1918, entire provinces were effectively ungoverned. The civilian population in Anatolia was experiencing famine conditions. Industrial production had collapsed. The currency had lost most of its value. And then, in September of 1918, the final hammer fell. At the Battle of Megiddo in northern Palestine, Allenby destroyed what was left of the Ottoman field armies in a 38-hour engagement. The road to Damascus was open. The road to Aleppo was open. The road to the heartland of Anatolia itself was open. The war was over. The empire was finished. On October 30th, 1918, aboard the British battleship HMS Agamemnon, anchored in the harbour of Mudros on the island of Lemnos, an Ottoman delegation signed an armistice with the Allied powers. The terms were brutal. The Ottoman army was to be demobilized. Ottoman ports were to be surrendered to Allied control. The Allies were given the right to occupy any Ottoman territory they considered strategically necessary. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles, the straits that had defended Constantinople for centuries, were to be open to Allied warships. Within 2 weeks, Allied fleets steamed up the Bosphorus and dropped anchor in front of the Sultan's palace. British, French, Italian and Greek troops marched into Istanbul. For the first time since 1453, the capital of the Ottoman Empire was under foreign occupation. The Sultan, now maimed VI, who had ascended the throne only months before, was effectively a prisoner in his own palace. He could not pass a law, appoint a minister, or send a telegram without Allied permission. What followed over the next 2 years was less a peace settlement than a feeding frenzy. The Allies had agreed in secret wartime treaties to divide the Ottoman territories among themselves. Britain would take Mesopotamia and Palestine. France would take Syria and Lebanon. Italy would get a slice of southwestern Anatolia. Greece would get Smyrna, the great port city on the Aegean coast that had a large Greek population, along with much of the surrounding region. The Armenians would get an independent state in eastern Anatolia. The Kurds were promised some kind of autonomous arrangement. What remained of Turkish-ruled territory would be a small landlocked rump state in the central Anatolian plateau, with the straits internationalized and the capital itself under permanent Allied supervision. All of this was formalized in the Treaty of Sevres, signed in August of 1920 by representatives of the Sultan's government. On paper, it was the death certificate of the Ottoman Empire. The empire that had besieged Vienna twice was being reduced to a protectorate the size of a medium European country, and even that fragment was to exist only at the pleasure of the powers occupying its capital. The Sultan signed because he had no choice. He signed because he believed that signing was the only way to preserve the dynasty, the throne, and his own position. He was about to discover that he had badly misread the situation. A revolution was already underway in Anatolia. In May of 1919, a Greek expeditionary force landed at Smyrna and began pushing inland. The landing was authorized by the Allied powers and protected by Allied warships sitting offshore. Greek troops, accompanied by Greek civilian volunteers, began occupying Turkish villages in the surrounding region. Atrocities followed almost immediately. Turkish civilians were killed. Mosques were desecrated. Refugees began streaming east into the interior, carrying with them stories of what was happening on the coast. The Greek landing accomplished something the Sultan's government had been unable to prevent, and something the Allies had not anticipated. It gave the scattered, defeated, demoralized Turkish population something to unite against. And it did so just as the right man was arriving in the right place at the right time. 4 days before the Greek landing, on May 15, 1919, the Sultan's government had appointed Mustafa Kemal as inspector of the 9th Army in eastern Anatolia. His official assignment was to oversee the demobilization of remaining Ottoman troops in the interior in compliance with the Armistice. He landed at the Black Sea port of Samsun on May 19, 1919. He had no intention of demobilizing anyone. Kemal was 38 years old. He was the hero of Gallipoli, one of the few Ottoman commanders to emerge from the war with his reputation enhanced rather than destroyed. He was politically connected. He was intellectually formidable. He was a heavy drinker, a chain smoker, an insomniac, and absolutely convinced that the Ottoman dynasty had become an obstacle to the survival of the Turkish people. From the moment his ship docked at Samsun, he began organizing what would become a parallel government in defiance of the Sultan and the occupying powers. He traveled from town to town in the interior, meeting with army officers who had refused to surrender their units, with provincial governors who were sympathetic to resistance, with religious leaders who saw the Greek invasion as an existential threat. He convened a series of congresses at Erzurum and Sivas in the summer of 1919, where delegates from across Anatolia agreed on a basic program. The borders of the Turkish homeland would be defended. Foreign occupation would be resisted. The nation, not the dynasty, would be the source of political legitimacy. The Sultan's government in Istanbul ordered Kemal recalled. He ignored the order. They stripped him of his rank. He ignored that too. It declared him an outlaw and sentenced him to death in absentia. It made no difference. The revolution was already moving. On April 23, 1920, in the dusty central Anatolian town of Ankara, a new parliament called the Grand National Assembly opened its first session. Its members had been elected from across the unoccupied territories. Its president was Mustafa Kemal. From its first day, it declared itself the only legitimate government of the Turkish nation. It rejected the authority of the Sultan's ministers in Istanbul. It rejected the Treaty of Sevres before it was even signed. And it began the work of building a state from scratch in the middle of a war. That war was about to get much worse. Encouraged by Allied support and convinced that Turkish resistance was disorganized, the Greek army launched a major offensive in the summer of 1920, pushing deeper into Anatolia. They captured Bursa. They drove east toward Ankara itself. By the summer of 1921, Greek troops were within 50 miles of the new Turkish capital. Kemal personally took command of the Turkish forces and made a stand along the Sakarya River. The Battle of Sakarya lasted 21 days and nights without pause. It was fought across a front that stretched for nearly 60 miles. Kemal, suffering from a broken rib after a riding accident days before the battle began, directed the defense from a stretcher. He gave one of the most famous orders in modern Turkish military history. There is no line of defense. There is a surface of defense. That surface is the entire homeland. When the battle ended, in September of 1921, the Greek advance had been stopped. A year later, in August of 1922, Kemal launched the counteroffensive that would end the war. The Turkish army shattered the Greek lines in a matter of days and pursued the broken Greek forces westward across Anatolia. On September 9th, Turkish cavalry rode into Smyrna. The city that had been the symbol of the Greek occupation, the prize the Allies had handed to Athens 3 years earlier, was back in Turkish hands. What happened next was horrific. A fire broke out in the Armenian quarter of the city on September 13th. It spread through the Greek and European districts and burned for 4 days. Tens of thousands of Greek and Armenian civilians were killed, were drowned trying to swim out to Allied ships sitting in the harbor, or were forced into death marches into the interior. The exact responsibility for the fire is still debated. The Greek presence in Anatolia was finished. So was the Treaty of Sevres. With the Greek army destroyed, Kemal turned his attention to the Allied garrisons still occupying the straits and the city of Istanbul itself. In late September of 1922, Turkish cavalry units rode up to the British perimeter at Chanak, the Allied fortified zone on the Asian side of the Dardanelles. The British commander on the spot had orders to hold his line. The Turkish commander had orders to test it. For about 3 weeks, the world held its breath as British and Turkish troops stood face to face, rifles loaded, waiting for somebody to make a mistake. The mistake never came. In London, the British cabinet was divided. Prime Minister David Lloyd George wanted to fight. Most of his ministers did not. The French and Italians made it clear they would not support a new war. The British public, exhausted by the World War that had ended only 4 years earlier, had no appetite for another one over a piece of Turkish coastline. On October 11, 1922, British and Turkish representatives signed the Armistice of Mudanya. The Allies agreed to withdraw from eastern Thrace. The Turkish nationalists agreed not to advance on Istanbul before a formal peace treaty could be negotiated. The military situation was settled. The political situation was not. There were now, technically, 2 Turkish governments. The Sultan's ministers still sat in Istanbul, recognized by the Allies, recognized by no one else. The Grand National Assembly sat in Ankara, recognized by its own people and increasingly by the world. They could not both exist much longer. On November 1st, 1922, the Grand National Assembly voted to abolish the Sultanate. The vote was carried out in the Assembly Chamber in Ankara, far from the palace in Istanbul, where the institution being abolished actually still resided. Mustafa Kemal made the case personally. He argued that the dynasty had become a tool of foreign occupation, that legitimate sovereignty belonged to the nation rather than to a hereditary ruler, that the office of Sultan had effectively ceased to function the moment maimed VI signed the Treaty of Sevres. When the vote was called, the chamber approved the resolution by acclamation. A 623-year-old institution was abolished by a show of hands in an afternoon. The Sultan was no longer the Sultan. He was a 61-year-old man named Mehmed Vahiddin, living in a palace that no longer belonged to him, in a city he no longer ruled, in a country that had moved on without him. 16 days later, he climbed into that British ambulance. The man who had once been Sultan maimed, VI never set foot in Turkey again. He spent his final years in exile on the Italian Riviera, living off the charity of relatives and the slow sale of his remaining personal possessions. When he died in San Remo in May of 1926, his creditors briefly impounded his body to settle outstanding debts before the funeral could take place. The last Sultan of the House of Osman, descendant of a dynasty that had conquered Constantinople, was buried in Damascus. He left no kingdom to inherit. While Mehmed wandered Europe in his final years, Kemal was building something new on the wreckage. In July of 1923, after months of difficult negotiations at the Swiss city of Lausanne, the Turkish nationalists signed a new treaty with the Allies. The Treaty of Lausanne replaced the Treaty of Sevres entirely. It recognized the borders that Turkish armies had won in the field. It ended the foreign occupation. It abolished the legal privileges that European powers had held over Ottoman territory for centuries. It was the first treaty signed at the end of the First World War in which a defeated power dictated terms more or less on equal footing with the victors. On October 29, 1923, the Grand National Assembly proclaimed the Republic of Turkey. Mustafa Kemal was elected its first president. 5 months later, in March of 1924, the assembly abolished the caliphate as well. The last caliph, a cousin of the deposed sultan named Abdülmecid II, was given a few hours to pack and was placed on a train to the Bulgarian border. The institution that had claimed spiritual leadership over the global Sunni Muslim community for more than 4 centuries ceased to exist by legislative vote. This is the strange thing about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. It did not really fall in a single battle or a single afternoon. It bled out over a century of reform, war, and rebellion, and then in its final years it collapsed faster than anyone watching could quite track. The empire that lost the World War in 1918 was not the empire that signed the Armistice at Mudros, was not the empire that signed the Treaty of Sevres, was not the empire that lost its army to Mustafa Kemal, was not the empire that abolished itself in November of 1922. Each version was killed and replaced before the next one fully understood what had happened. What collapsed overnight was not a state. It was the idea that the state still existed. If this story surprised you, drop a comment with your thoughts and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you found this worth watching, a like goes a long way.